If you are into Japanese sports cars, you've probably heard of the legendary 276 horsepower gentleman's agreement. It's the reason why many of the most iconic Japanese sports cars, from the Nissan GT-R to the Toyota Supra to the Mazda RX-7, all seem to have the exact same horsepower number on paper. But what exactly was this agreement? Why did it exist? And why did Japanese automakers really stick to it? Today we are diving deep into the origins, the effects, and the eventual decline of one of the most fascinating chapters in automotive history. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Japan was booming. Its economy was on fire, and Japanese automakers were making some of the most advanced and exciting cars on the planet. This was the era that gave us the first iterations of legendary vehicles like the Honda NSX, the Nissan Skyline GT-R, the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution, the Subaru WRX, the Mazda RX-7, etc., etc., etc. Japanese manufacturers were pushing boundaries, creating sports cars that rivaled European supercars in performance and technology. But there was one thing they all had in common. None of them officially made more than 276 horsepower. The Gentleman's Agreement was an informal understanding among Japan's automakers to voluntarily limit the horsepower of their vehicles to 276 horsepower or 280 PS, the metric system equivalent, to avoid a horsepower war. It wasn't a legal requirement, but it was something that all the major manufacturers, Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Mitsubishi, Mazda, and Subaru, abided by. Although Subaru is the head gasket, 276. Anyway. But why 276 horsepower? To understand that, we need to look at the context in which these cars were developed. The primary reason for the agreement was safety. In the late 1980s, Japan's roads were becoming more and more congested, and the government was increasingly worried about the risks posed by more powerful cars and dangerous drivers. Car accidents were on the rise, and there were genuine concerns that if manufacturers kept chasing higher horsepower numbers, it would encourage more reckless driving and lead to an increase in accidents and fatalities. There was also a concern that higher horsepower figures would make performance cars less accessible to the general public. At the time, the Japanese government was promoting the idea of responsible driving, and it was believed that if manufacturers kept increasing the power of their sports cars, it would send the wrong message to consumers. Basically, we're giving you all the horsepower, you can use all the horsepower, right? Well, in response, Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, or JAMA, came together and agreed to voluntarily limit the horsepower of their cars to 276. This way they could avoid escalating the competition, and the government wouldn't need to step in with stricter, more heavy-handed regulations. While the Gentleman's Agreement was in place, Japan's automakers were, let's be honest, fiercely competitive with one another. Even though they all agreed to abide by the 276 horsepower limit, it was more of a public relations move than a true limitation of the car's potential. In reality, these cars were often significantly more powerful than their official ratings suggested. Take, for example, the Nissan Skyline GT-R. Pick the year, it doesn't really matter. On paper, the 32, 33, and 34 were all rated at 276 all-wheel horsepower, but anyone who's put one on a dyno can tell you that the actual output was much closer to 320 to 330 horsepower, even in stock trim. The Mark IV Supra was another car that adhered to the Gentleman's Agreement in Japan, making 276 horsepower, but the worldwide models made 320 with the same engine and transmission setup. The same can be said for cars like the Lancer Evolution and the Subaru WRX STI. Manufacturers were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible within the rules. Many enthusiasts loved this aspect of Japanese car culture. It almost became a regular running joke among enthusiasts. It says 276, but we all know the truth, right? The Gentleman's Agreement also fueled the rise of Japan's infamous tuning culture, which was in its infancy in the 90s. Since the cars were already capable of producing more power than their official ratings suggested, it wasn't long before tuning shops like HKS, Greddy, Apexi, etc., started developing aftermarket parts that could unlock even more power from these cars. The era of the JDM tuner car was born, and Japanese sports cars became synonymous with incredible tuning potential. Take the Skyline GT-R again, with simple bolt-ons like taking the stock twins off and putting on a bigger single. From an intercooler and ECU tune injectors, blah 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 blah, owners could easily make 500 wheel horsepower out of their GT-R. Similarly, the Mark IV Supra with the legendary 2JZ GTE engine was known for being able to handle upwards of 800 horsepower on the stock bottom end. The Gentleman's Agreement created a perfect storm for Japanese tuning culture to step in and allow the aftermarket to provide the horsepower that the factory wasn't able to. This became true in Japan as well as in the US, where these cars achieved cult status. For more than a decade, the Gentleman's Agreement held strong, with manufacturers remaining at that 276 mark, but by the mid-2000s, cracks were beginning to appear. Global competition was intensifying, and Japanese automakers were feeling the pressure from European and American manufacturers who were producing cars with significantly more power. Companies like BMW BMW, Mercedes-AMG, and Porsche were dominating the performance market with cars flirting with 400 horsepower, Japanese manufacturers could not afford to fall behind. In 2004, Honda was the first to break the agreement with the release of the Honda Legend, a luxury sedan that produced 300 ponies. This move signaled the beginning of the end for the gentleman's agreement, but the real death blow came in 2007 when Nissan launched the R35 GT-R, the spiritual successor to the Skyline GT-R. The R35 came with a twin-turbocharged VR38 DETT engine that officially made 480 horsepower, nearly double the gentleman's agreement mark, and started the beginning of a new era of performance cars coming out of Japan. Other manufacturers quickly followed suit, the new Lexus LFA producing 552 horsepower, and the Nissan 370Z, a car attainable by mere mortals, was rated at 332. Japanese automakers were now free to openly compete in the global horsepower wars, and while they never really won, the era of artificially limiting power was over.
Listen up, everybody. I have some news. It's over.
So, did the gentleman's agreement achieve its goals? Well, on the surface, it might seem like the agreement was little more than a marketing ploy, but it did have a legitimate lasting impact on the industry. For one, it kept the focus on engineering and innovation rather than just cranking that horsepower dial up to 11. Japanese automakers were forced to develop cars that excelled in areas like handling, braking, aerodynamics, and reliability while making that power, qualities that still define Japanese performance cars even to this day. It also helped foster the tuning culture that remains an integral part of JDM car culture, and heck, the reason companies like us are even here. The fact that these cars were so easily tunable meant they became a playground for the aftermarket who wanted to squeeze every little bit of performance out of their machines. Even though the gentleman's agreement is no longer in place, its legacy lives on in many ways. The cars developed during this era, like the Supra, the Skyline, and the RX-7, are you sick of me talking about them yet, are now legendary in the automotive world, revered not only for their performance, but for their untapped performance potential. Japanese automakers have since embraced more powerful engines, with models like the GT-R, the LFA, and the Acura NSX proudly displaying their horsepower numbers. Today, Japanese sports cars from the gentleman's agreement era continue to hold immense value among collectors and enthusiasts, not just because of what they were, but because of what they represented. A blend of performance, of precision, of engineering, and ingenuity that shaped the global perception of Japanese cars. The 276 horsepower agreement might have been a self-imposed limit, but it helped create some of the most iconic cars in automotive history, and its influence is still felt in JDM culture that we know and love to this day. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If topics like this interest you, if you want us to make more videos like this, drop a comment down below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to turn on notifications, head on over to our website and pick up some wheels, and I'll see you in the next one.